Okay, let's talk about C Sharp. We'll spend a few lectures on C Sharp, starting from language basics. Normally, it would take longer than this to learn a new programming language. But fortunately for us, everybody in the class is already familiar with Java, and C Sharp happens to be very similar to Java, so we don't have to learn everything from scratch. Throughout the discussion of C Sharp, I'll try to relate and compare C Sharp language features to Java ones. Note that this is not to say one language is better than the other. Instead, the purpose is really just to learn new things by relating to our existing knowledge about similar things. That being said, I personally do find C Sharp more enjoyable to program than Java. But anyway, let's get started. As always, let's first create a hello world type of program in C Sharp. We'll use Visual Studio, of course. Like in Eclipse, when we program Java, we'll first create a project. So let's click this Create New Project option. And there are lots of project templates to choose from. We want to create a console project using C Sharp first. So you can select C Sharp in the language drop-down menu and console in the project type drop-down menu. This will leave us with two options, console application and the console app parentheses .NET framework. Remember, we want to use .NET Core, so do not choose the .NET Framework option. That is the old .NET Frameworks. Choose the first one. As you can see from the description, it uses .NET Core, and our application will be able to run on Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. In this step, we'll give the project a name, which can be anything, and pay attention to the location of the project. This is the directory where you can find your projects, and by default is your user directory, under which there will be a folder called source, under which there will be a folder called repos, and this is where your projects will be if you don't change the default location. And then you need to specify a solution name, which again can be anything. It doesn't have to be the same as the project name. When you create a new project in Visual Studio, it will always ask you to create a solution for it. A solution may contain multiple projects. In Java, it's not too often that you'll see a project that contains several sub-projects. In C Sharp, it's actually quite common to see a solution that contains multiple projects. Part of the reason may be that in .NET, each project can only have one entry point. For example, if you have two programs, each with its own main method, then you have to put these two programs in two different projects. The information about a solution is in a .sln file, and each project has a .csproj file, stand for CS project, of course, C Sharp project. Most of the time, Visual Studio automatically updates these files, so we don't need to manually change them. We'll see what our project file looks like later. Now we need to pick our target framework, and you can see for .NET, our Visual Studio has three options. .NET Core, it has three options, 2.1, 3.1, and 5.0. We'll use 5.0 because it's the latest. And now the project is created. It also creates a skeleton program that we can use as a starting point. Before we look at the code, let's first look at the Solution Explorer on the right-hand side. Solution Explorer gives us the overall view of the solution/project. Note that there are two basic views of a project. By default, it shows the so-called solution view. In this view, it shows the solution, the project, and the dependency of the project, meaning the libraries used by the projects, and the source code files, of course. We can use this button to switch to a different view, namely the folder view. Just click on folder view. Folder view basically shows the solution in a folder structure as in the file system. So it will be the same as if you look inside the folders here. Note that it will show you some additional files and folders that are hidden in the solution view. For example, you can find the project file here, and the solution file here, and a couple of additional folders called bin and object, OBJ, which contain code that are compiled from your source code. Clicking on the solution file will take us back to the solution view. Let's do one more thing before we look at the code. I want to add the project to version control using Git. We can do that either by using the file menu and select Add to Version Control, or if your Visual Studio by default shows a tab called Git Changes tab, you can also use that. Since my Visual Studio doesn't show that tab by default, I'm going to use this one. Either way, it will show you this window and ask if you want to create also a remote repository on GitHub or just a local repository. And I'm just going to use a local repository. And we'll create. And yeah, now we have the Git Changes tab here. Okay, so now our code is version controlled using Git. This is not a course about Git, so I'm not going to spend time talking about Git. If you already know Git, great, but if you don't, you can skip this step, and that's perfectly fine. With that said, using Git is certainly beneficial, at least in two aspects in this class. First, it helps you to keep track of your changes. For example, here it says hello world. Let's say I want to change it to hello 4540. And with Git, you can easily see what you have changed simply by going to the Git Changes tab and click on the file, and you can see that you have changed this line, and it used to be Word and now it's CS4540. So having a version control system like this is very beneficial to programming in general. But there's another benefit for this class. We are going to ask you to submit your assignments by packaging your projects into a zip file. And using the git archive command is a very quick and nice way to create a zip file of your source code without all the additional compiled code and other stuff. So the command is git archive-o, and then the output file name, and then head meaning the latest version in the repository. And in order to do that, let's first commit our change here. So I'm going to add this or state this file, and then I'll commit the change and say change word to 4540, and then we'll commit. So now I can go to command line and do a git archive command. So we'll go to the solution folder, and we'll say git archive-o console app1.zip and head. And you can see that now it creates a zip file, and this zip file has everything we want for the project. Oh, side note, if you use Windows, I highly recommend that you install this Windows Terminal app. What you can do is just go to Microsoft Store and search for Windows Terminal. And then after you install it, you'll get a Windows Terminal app that looks like this. In this class, we don't use command line often, but we do use it occasionally, especially later on when we use Entity Framework Core. Windows Terminal is just a lot nicer to use than use for command line than the default command window. There are lots of settings you can play with, like themes and so on. In particular, there's a setting for starting directory. Oh, here. Sorry about that. It used to be a JSON file that you just added, but now they created a GUI, and I was actually not very familiar with the new GUI. Anyway, you can see that you can set a starting directory so that it will start the terminal inside the directory where your projects are. So, okay, finally the code. There is some new terminology here, but for the most part it's quite similar to Java. First, we have namespace, which is basically like package in Java. Here, system is a namespace that contains lots of classes, and as you can probably guess, using system means importing the classes from the system namespace, just like when we say import package in Java. Here we are creating a new namespace called console app1, and in this namespace we create a class called program, and inside the class there's a main method. All these are pretty much the same as in Java. There is an important difference between C# and Java, and that's the relation between class/package and file/directory. In Java, A public class must be in a file with the same name, except for inner classes. And package name must match directory structure. For example, if you have a package called foo.bar, then on this there must be a folder called foo and a subfolder called bar. In C#, there's no such relation or requirement at all. For example, you can have a file called program, but the class is called program1, which is perfectly fine. And you can have multiple namespace inside the same file. And that, again, is perfectly fine. In fact, later, when we talk about partial class, you'll see that you can even have one class that spans several files. All in all, C# is much more flexible when it comes to class and files. There's another difference between C# and Java, and that's the main method. In Java, the signature of the main method is, if you remember, is public static void main and then a string parameter, string array parameter, something like this. In C#, there are actually multiple valid main method signatures. For example, a main method can be public or private. It can return void or an integer depending on whether you want to return a so-called exit code. It can take arguments or not depending on whether you use command-line arguments. It can even be asynchronous, which we'll talk more later when we get to the asynchronous programming part. You can check out the C# documentation to see all the valid main method signatures. So let's take a quick look. And here you can see all the valid main method signatures. And very briefly, the naming conventions. You'll probably notice that in C#, the main method has a capital M instead of the lowercase m in Java. In C#, the naming convention is to use Pascal case for anything public or kind of public. Kind of public meaning things with access modifiers like internal or protected. Basically anything that's not private. For private members and local variables, use camel case, meaning lowercase for the first letter. There are some additional rules. Please check out the linked specifications if you are interested. But knowing these two rules are more than sufficient to get us started. And last but not least, let's actually run the program. So simply click this Run button. And it shows the hello message, and just press any key to close this console window. Or just close it here. Okay. This is a quick introduction of how to create a C# program and some things related to a C# program like solution, projects, and some basic usage of Visual Studio. We'll stop here, and for readings, please read Chapter 2 of the Pro C# 9 book. Thanks, and see you in the next video.